the bulk of the reduction that we are seeing in the growth activity is coming from a reduction in investment by the corporates. As far as we can make out, the SME sector is continuing to invest strongly.
Is taking a little bit of tumble, and that is not because of consumer acceptance issues, that is because of corporate governance
Absolutely.
issues.
Bright minds, innovative ideas, and a newfound entrepreneurial spirit. But does India offer the right ecosystem for entrepreneurs to do business? And do we need a national entrepreneurship policy? That's the topic on We Mean Business today. I'm Shweta Rajpal-Kohli. Let me introduce our guests on the show. With me here, Mr. J.S. Bhalla, CEO and founder of CocoBerry; Rahul Khanna, Managing Director of Canon India. Also joining us, Alok Kejriwal, CEO and co-founder of Games to Win; Dr. Krishna Tanuku, ED of Vadvani Center for Entrepreneurship Development, ISB Hyderabad. Also Manish Sabharwal, Chairman and co-founder of Team Lease Services. Thank you all for joining us and being with us here on this very, very special show. Let me throw open the discussion to first try and understand the hurdles to entrepreneurship, how easy or difficult it is really to do business in India and to set up a new business in India. Let me start by actually asking the CocoBerry founder all about his experience, what's it been like, and what does India really need to do to improve the overall ecosystem for entrepreneurship?
First and foremost, this is not my first entrepreneurial venture. So
Right.
I've always been an entrepreneur, and I've seen 2 decades of the change that has transpired in India. Back in the 90s, when I started my first company, anybody who'd speak to me about getting into, what they conventionally call as, I want to be a businessman, I used to say, here are 5 names, and go to the ROC and get one of them approved.
Okay.
So you used to have to go to, ROC office in Asif Ali Road in Delhi to get a name approved. Things have moved on from there considerably, but I think we still have a long way to go. And as far as the whole ecosystem is concerned, I think there is a consensus amongst everyone at this point is that, since small business and new entrepreneurial ventures, innovation ultimately becomes a game changer in developing economies. I think this is an area that we need to considerably focus on. From my perspective, we've come a long way, but we still have a very long way to go.
All right, we seem to have come a long way. You mentioned innovation, but does innovation always get the right atmosphere to actually develop from just being a dream, something which has come as an idea, into a real business opportunity that can be scaled up? And that's where I'd like Rahul to bring his perspective. While he's saying things have come a long way, there are others who also believe that we are facing a situation of over-regulation right now, where just the amount of paperwork, the regulatory hurdles are making it almost impossible for entrepreneurs to say that, yes, it is easy, I want to set up a business, I can go ahead and do it.
Sure. So I think the tragedy is we're a nation of small entrepreneurs, right? And what we really need to is be a nation where a few of these break out, a few thousand of these businesses break out and become large companies.
Right.
We have probably 100 million people joining the workforce in the next 10 years, and we need to create many, many more jobs. The public sector is not doing a great job of job creation. Actually, jobs are falling. Agriculture is not hiring many more people. And sectors like banking are actually stagnant. Over the last 20 years, they've not added any headcount. So actually, we do need many more jobs to be created. I think innovation, will get funded. However, scalability is also very important.
Right. Okay, so capital and scalability. Mr. Alok Kejriwal, you're someone who's been there, done that. Explain to us how, in fact, why don't you advise entrepreneurs, budding entrepreneurs, on how to go forward with these 2 aspects of the entire value chain, scalability as well as funding. Let's talk about funding first.
So, I think my tenet has always been, capital chases entrepreneur. Entrepreneur never chases capital. If you're begging out there and trying to get money for something, I think you're starting off on the wrong foot. If you do the right things, you get noticed. I mean, I have my venture capitalist, Rahul, actually funded my company 5 years ago, and we had met and we kind of talked, and neither of us pleaded each other to get funded. So I think it's a very clear understanding of, I'm doing something that the VC likes and the VC does something that I like, we marry each other. And if you waste your time running after money, then you're not going to do your business. On the scalability part, to be honest, there's no mantra, there's no recipe. You can't read it off a cookbook or in a business school. These are the 7 things you do to scale. I mean, scale happens when a lot of people either like what you do or they don't. So I don't think people should or get obsessed by, I will only scale this. I think it's getting it right and getting it right for simply getting it right. Nobody knew Twitter because it sounds so stupid. How do you use a @ handle and tweet a message? But it's massive scale because it turned out to be useful. So I think if you do something really useful for a lot of people, that's scale. There's no other dictionary meaning to it. I think the world has shrunk. I think we're obsessed about India. I think we're obsessed about what does my neighbor guy say and what does my market say. If there are enough entrepreneurs in India, there's enough venture capital. Rahul again comes from an international firm. There are lots of people who funded Games to Win from external sources. You can be a VC from India, from the US, funding an entrepreneur in India for markets going back to the US. So it doesn't have to be India-centric.
All right, that's an interesting perspective, and I'd like to ask Dr. Krishna as to whether you can actually help entrepreneurs go about their task of setting up a new business. Is it something that can be nurtured? Can you help develop entrepreneurship?
Good evening, Saifa. The short answer to that question is partially yes. But before that, you started the question about the entrepreneurship ecosystem, and then broadly in terms of the scale, some of my panelists talked about the scale. Scale not necessarily limited to at the individual level. As one of my co-panelists said, we need to create as a nation about 100 million jobs or more between now and in 10 years. And for that, for that to happen, we need a lot of different elements that need to come together as an ecosystem. One is, of course, is funding. The other one is also access to innovations. And you see a lot of R&D money is being spent, but how much of that is accessible to entrepreneurs to build products and services that are marketable and sustainable? The third thing is, when we talk about policies at that level, you also need to talk about the sustainability and the inclusivity across all segments of the society. Then only that level of economic activity creation through entrepreneurship can be sustained, which means we need a very strong policy framework to start with that would cover all the different elements of the ecosystem.
Okay, I want to talk about the policy framework at great length, but I'd like to also ask Manish Sabharwal, Chairman and co-founder of TeamLease Services, as to whether we're seeing this trend of more and more people willing to quit their high-paying jobs to become entrepreneurs. Is that something that is emerging as a very significant trend over the last few years?
I mean, India always has had a huge tradition of entrepreneurship. I mean, 50% of our labor force is self-employed, but there's an entrepreneur, you can start two kinds of companies, a baby and a dwarf. And a baby and a dwarf are both small, but one is going to grow and one is going to stay there. My take is that the overwhelming number of companies in India are dwarfs. Some of them is ambition, some of them is role models, but a large part of it is just the regulatory cholesterol, which we have to substitute for the state as entrepreneurs. So it's not what the state is doing, it's what the state is not doing. So you have to generate your own power, you have to generate your own, provide your own transport, provide your own security. In some case, you have to train your own employees. So I think the burden for an entrepreneur is much higher here in that sense because the state is not doing what it does. But we already have a large number of entrepreneurs, 50% of our labor force, which means about 225 million people are self-employed. But we need a different kind of self-employment. Obviously, that has accelerated in the last 20 years of economic reform. But I think that there is opportunity for increasing that substantially in terms of the DNA of the kind of entrepreneurs and the DNA of the kind of companies with scale.
Okay, again, an interesting perspective there, but now let's talk about the regulatory environment, because we often hear that India as a country is over-regulating. We don't want so much excessive government interference, and then we talk about a national entrepreneurship policy which would actually encourage entrepreneurs. Is there a case for the government to step in here and ensure that we can actually encourage entrepreneurship? Rahul, your view first.
Sure. So I think, the government's doing its bit. I think as foreign investors, one of the things we seek is a consistent playing field, right? And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is the goalpost keeps moving with regards to the rules that govern our investments in India. So I think what we need is, a status quo on policy. Once something has been decided, it shouldn't be changed retrospectively. But I think the government also needs to look at it slightly more holistically. As financial investors, our hands are tied in terms of what financial instruments we can use to invest into India. And oftentimes that may not be the best thing for us. It may not be the best thing for the business. So for instance, it's very difficult for us to actually lend to an Indian company unless we set up an NBFC in India, and that has very high capitalization requirements. Now for a small company that may not want to dilute a lot of equity, ideally they'd like to take a loan, but we're not in a position to lend to them. So I think what we need to do is take a step back and look at the stages of financing that a company needs to go through, and also look at the rules and regulations that govern what foreign investors can do in India and can't do in India.
Okay, given that, Mr. Bhalla, explain to us what is it that an entrepreneur seeks from a regulatory environment?
I think first and foremost, one, as an entrepreneur, you would, and especially in a country like India, which is so diverse and such a difficult landscape and such a challenging landscape to scale up a business. I think there was a question about scaling up a business in India.
Right.
That itself has a huge amount of challenge. Access to capital and capital markets, cost of capital, all these areas are things that need to be addressed, like Rahul pointed out. And sometimes, as an entrepreneur, one thing you learn fairly quickly is that debt is the cheapest form of capital.
Yeah.
Whereas in India, typically to raise debt, you require high forms of collaterals. And at the same time, when you look at private equity funds or alternative sources of funding, which might not be easily accessible to smaller companies or startup companies. At the same time, from a regulatory standpoint, my perspective is all markets are overregulated. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the developed markets, the kind of paperwork that needs to be completed to run a business successfully and to maintain, that kind of compliance is probably equal, if not more, than India. So I'm of the perspective that regulatory framework is what it is, but I think the overall ecosystem, which is access to capital, opportunity for people to scale up businesses rapidly in India, the consuming class, the incomes of the consuming class growing as a byproduct of creating more opportunity through innovation and through giving entrepreneurship opportunities to smaller companies, would ultimately lead to a more favorable market in India than it is currently. So I don't personally have this perspective that it's only going to be regulatory requirements that the government needs to fulfill, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done.
So you're saying overall, if the economy grows, if there is enough money in the system, if the purchasing power is good, then any idea can be scaled up. Is that correct?
Of course.
Would you
Yeah, I
agree
think
with
what
that?
I'd add to that, obviously the government, in entrepreneurship is going to happen despite the government, right? That's the fact, right? And if GS was waiting around for the regulations to change, he'd never get started, right? So I think what we really need to do is sort of build a supporting infrastructure so that, the next generation of entrepreneur has an easier journey. So for instance, the kind of incubation facilities that are available, the kind of infrastructure that's available in other parts of the world for a young company, whether it's a incubation center or it's a lab, that kind of infrastructure needs to start to become available.
Alok, would you like to add to that? Because you mentioned right at the beginning of the show that, if there is a good idea, there will be capital that will chase the idea. Do you think the regulatory environment does not have any role to play? Do you think there is enough capital chasing good ideas?
So, at the outset, less government is good government. We don't want government in our lives. Forget it. We don't want these guys. We don't want them to show up on our door. The less we see them, the better.
Entrepreneurship policy at all?
It's all bunk, honest. The most important thing is this, right? I think if you look at I have to sign at 8 or 10 places to remit money. When I send money, like if I send $300 abroad to a vendor, I have to sign in 8 places. That is stupid. Why are there 8 forms? If I've been struggling to get a board of advisors for my company, and there are 4 or 5 people who can never afford. I just want to give them 0.25, 0.5% of my company. Now, I cannot allot ESOPs to foreign nationals. For that, I have to have a Games to Win Inc. I have to have an Inc. company in Delaware. I mean, I think You know, it's like saying that even for us to drive a car, the government has put up so many speed breakers that my car will brake, forget trying to cross the speed breakers. So if we can just say, tell the government, look, get out of our lives, don't show up, just become invisible, and just make life simple for simple people like us, I think that'll be the best form of government.
Okay, Manish, would you like to add to that?
I would disagree. I think in the last 20 years, I think all of us in corporate India said that, you know, this grass grows at night while the government sleeps. And I think we're realizing the limits of that model. We can't generate our own power. We can't provide our water. We can't provide our public transport. So while a national entrepreneurship policy is a horizontal and the government is organized vertically, so like sort of horizontal issues like skills and education, it will be hard to implement. But a national entrepreneurship policy is really about infrastructure, about urban planning, about public transport. I think we're not asking, I don't think the government is sort of should set up a venture capital fund and invest in stuff, but it needs to just let an entrepreneur focus on his business and provide the public infrastructure. So when you talk about regulatory problems, you're talking about the sins of commission, which is what the government is doing wrong. I'm talking about the sins of omission. You know, a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem, whether it is in the US or Silicon Valley or Israel or anywhere in the world, does not have a flailing state. In fact, a strong state or an effective state is a different question than a big state or a small state. So I don't think that after 20 years of seeing what's happened post-reform, we can say that if the government goes away, we'll have a Cambrian explosion of entrepreneurship, because I think infrastructure for entrepreneurs is something that we do need. And that is something on which our small companies will become big companies.
Okay, Alok, I know you have a point to add to that before I go to the other panelists very quickly.
Yeah, I don't understand, you know, is making the roads and is making power something so unexpected of government? Is that entrepreneurship initiative? I mean, come on, man. Why these guys you know, why they've been hired by us? If they can't provide roads and power and, you know, they can't switch on my lights, and if that means it's an infrastructure policy, then I know what they're supposed to do there. Tomorrow, you know, securing me in my building and making sure the signals work, is that also part of helping entrepreneurs? I didn't get the point.
Okay, okay. Manish, would you like to respond to what Alok is saying?
Well, I just think there's enough evidence globally to suggest that government getting out of the way does not lead to a Cambrian explosion of entrepreneurship. There are some businesses, it may be a simplistic view of life, but I think if we're talking about economic growth, if we're talking about transitioning our labor force, 58% of our people and farms generate 15% of our GDP. 10 lakh kids will join the labor force every month for the next 20 years. These guys aren't going to be game developers or work on the web. So we need low-skill manufacturing. We need lots of job creation, which is not going to happen unless we have the infrastructure on which that is built. So while, yes, there will be some niches or rounding errors in the Indian job market which will work on technology or games, I think for the 440 million people whom we need to transition out of low productivity jobs, I think to say that infrastructure doesn't matter or the government should do its job, well, it's not doing its job, and that is a big barrier to entrepreneurship, and we need to fix it.
Okay, point taken. We can carry forward that discussion, but let me also introduce Pearl Uppal, founder of 5 Ideas, who's now with us in the discussion. Pearl, you've been through an entrepreneurial journey yourself. Now you seem to be funding startups. Take us through how the overall
look at it, three parts of the ecosystem that need to come together: funding, mentorship, business and society support, and then there is government acting, creating a catalytic environment for entrepreneurship to take place, making it just easy for entrepreneurs to start, operate, exit, close. All these are aspects of the business, accessing funds. And I think parts of the debate that I was hearing was that what can government do? Government can do a lot to promote all parts of these ecosystems. Funding, early stage funding, it can make it easier to lesser of a regulation in domestic investors plowing in money in early stage investing. It can create. Then there's the whole mentorship. I think businesses have a role to play. Individuals who've had experience before in entrepreneurship have a role to play. I mean, US is a clear example where angels almost comprise 70% of the early stage investments that come into the businesses. And so there's a lot to be done by providing mentorship to first-time entrepreneurs, and that's what 5 Ideas is really trying to do. Bring in early stage investments capable of supporting the angel stage, as well as bring mentorship, operating partnership, and linkages with big platform companies and mentors and investors to help businesses grow to the stage where venture capital and institutional funds find them viable to enter.
Okay, let's discuss each of the points that Pearl has raised here. Of course, funding, mentorship, as well as the government playing a catalytic role, which we've already discussed to some degree. Dr. Krishna, if I could get your thoughts on the entire issue of the government and whether or not it has a role to play, before I also go back to Alok to try and see if he agrees with what Pearl has said. But Dr. Krishna, to you first.
Yeah. First of all, the government has a very, very significant role to play. Is it playing effectively? The answer is no, currently. And there are bureaucratic delays which cause enormous challenges that we all face will not be addressed without significant government intervention. It doesn't mean that they have to be over-regulated. I would be the first person to say we need to have less regulation, but having a well-defined policy that would provide a holistic ecosystem for entrepreneurial development, from access to finance to access to innovation, is very critical.
But sir, would you like to respond to a proposal to set up a permanent national commission for entrepreneurs, which would have the Prime Minister as the chairperson? It would be a single entity at national and state level to facilitate entrepreneurs. It will inform and educate entrepreneurs about best practices globally, reduce the time for starting up of a business to about 2 weeks, generating wealth at a sustainable rate. These are some of the proposals that are being talked about. Your first reaction, Dr. Krishna, to some proposal like this? Do we need it at that level, or as Alok was also saying, that you really don't need the government to tell entrepreneurs how to go about doing or setting up a new business?
No, I think we need both. We need the individual entrepreneurs to take the lead, but at the same time, for example, if we have to meet the national economic challenges or social challenges, and who is going to look into, let's say, malnutrition is a challenge, and in order to address that challenge, a single entrepreneur cannot address such a challenge. A government entity or somebody needs to coordinate, bringing the social scientists, bringing the financial investors, bringing the science from various R&D institutions and technologies, the delivery models and so on. Those are the kinds of things that need to be facilitated. However, if there is an entrepreneurship policy body acting alone, independent of the national, let's say, innovation policy or national infrastructure policy, it won't work effectively. It's more than setting up just a single policy making body, but it has to be more of a coordinating agency which would facilitate removing all the hurdles and barriers and administrative barriers that the entrepreneurs are facing today.
All right, Alok, I know you've been wanting to respond. Quick response to what some of the panelists have said.
I think what you read out before was sounding like the Lokpal bill. I don't understand anything of what you said. It's just crazy.
Okay.
Secondly, I think there's a big disconnect on this panel. I think there's a question of hygiene. Of course, infrastructure is hygiene. Of course, malnutrition is hygiene. But the kind of entrepreneurship, I think Manish was, quick to whatever. But remember, IT started like that. When we had no IT and we were just, sending jute and cotton, that time we said, what is IT? But IT became a business. And the second point I want to make is people does not equal to entrepreneurship. We have Kingfisher staring at us. And that's a concept of lots of people, lots of money, lots of capital, lots of airline, lots of regulation, and a big, big fine mess. So I think the point here is there are many verticals in industry. One is basic hygiene, infrastructure, lots and lots of innovation, small niche industries. You can't lump them up as one big, Bollywood movie and say everybody's got a role to play. You don't. You got to take every industry, and the industry I come from, we just want to breathe clean, free air. We don't want anything else. We just want to be able to move in and out of the country, get people in and out. I can't give a visa to someone because the government doesn't allow that. I mean, that's ridiculous. So I think,
I'm going to get our Delhi panelists to respond to your very strong views.
There's a laissez-faire that we need.
Quick response to what Alok is saying.
I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle between what Alok is saying and what Manish mentioned. I think the ecosystem is what it is. It is the ecosystem. If the government would leave business alone to focus on innovation, on education, and focus on infrastructure and creating an ecosystem that entrepreneurship thrives in, that itself takes care of entrepreneurial opportunities. So I go by the quintessential definition of entrepreneurship by the Harvard Business School, and I've always lived by that, which is the relentless pursuit of opportunity without consideration of resources currently controlled. Awesome. Squarely put the onus on the government and say, if we create a national entrepreneurship council, things are going to change. But I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle, where if the government focuses on the things that it's supposed to focus on, rather than making steel and making, focusing on enterprises where, they develop software, for instance, I don't think that's the business of the government. They need to get out of that and focus on being the government, which is creating an ecosystem where entrepreneurship actually thrives.
Okay, Rahul,
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is actually findings of a committee that was put together by the Planning Commission over the last year, and actually had the participation of the government, of private equity firms, of consulting firms, of people from lending institutions, things like that. And candidly, it was a holistic view, and the recommendations actually came out of saying what's also worked in other markets, right? So we take a step back and look at IT. It has created about 10 or 12 million jobs in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's going to add another 15 million jobs in the next 10 years.
Right.
Now, we have to look back and say, what was the role of the government in allowing that to happen, right? But equally, when we look at the sunrise industries, and those are manufacturing and education and healthcare, they have a slightly different dynamic. So I think, obviously the role of the government is to facilitate financing, to allow for infrastructure to play out. And to GS's point, in a lot of ways, it's providing that platform, and then the private sector has to step up.
We're going to talk about capital because that is critical to entrepreneurship. What about capital for funding new ideas, for sustaining businesses, for scaling up businesses? Is there enough capital around to actually help entrepreneurs grow and set up and flourish their businesses? The entire discussion around capital, mentorship, and exiting businesses, all of that coming up after a quick break. Welcome back. You're watching We Mean Business, and we're discussing if India has the right ecosystem for entrepreneurs or not. We've discussed the entire issue of government and whether the government can or should stay away from the entire business of helping entrepreneurs. That's been an interesting discussion. We now move forward to talk about the availability of capital. Is there enough capital chasing good ideas for startups? Is there enough capital to help entrepreneurial ventures scale up their businesses? Rahul, to you first on that one.
Sure. So there's about probably $5 billion that's come into India in the last 5 years in early stage investing, right?
Okay.
And it's never been a better time than today to be an entrepreneur. I think between the efforts of folks like Pearl, who are trying to set up seed funds, there are about 10 or 15 other such platforms that are actually providing that first check to a company. The venture industry is also actually sitting on a fair amount of cash. So GS and I were just talking earlier, it's not necessarily the case that there isn't enough capital at this point in time.
Are there not enough ideas or proposals? Is that the case?
I think what we are talking about is, what are the kinds of businesses that can demonstrate an exit in a 7 to 10 year time frame, right? And one of the challenges of doing business in India is it just takes very long to create scale and to exit.
Right.
And so, the challenge is we have the capital, but not necessarily all of the businesses we look at fit the mold of what would make sense from a venture capital investment.
What makes sense from a venture capital investment?
So I think we look for three things. We look for a big market,
right?
We look for capital efficiency, and we look for something that creates differentiation over a longer period in time.
Is it also true that of the proposals that now go to venture capitalists or angel investors, shall we say 50 to 60% of them are now in the technology or the e-commerce space? Is that the real area where we are seeing a lot of activity, a lot of buzz around that? And how much has technology really played a role in terms of helping entrepreneurs?
Sure. So I think, actually it's not as skewed to technology alone. There is actually a fair amount of activity in the non-tech sector. There are domestic funds that are investing behind formats like retail and healthcare and education. So there's actually a fair amount of entrepreneurial activity outside of technology as well. It's just that the traditional venture capitalists coming out of, say, North America have had a bias towards technology. But we have a lot of other sources of capital, including domestic funds that are backing retail businesses and education businesses.
Would you agree, JS, the fact that traditional businesses or the brick and mortar businesses also have enough capital available?
I think capital is not a problem, and I always iterate that because capital will flow if you have a demonstrable, scalable business model. The problem, to Rahul's point, was the ability for businesses to scale up, especially brick and mortar businesses, to scale up fairly rapidly and return a high return on investment is very difficult in India. When you look at retail or you look at any other business, the cost of doing business is extremely high. The other problem with India is, I never subscribe to the opinion that it's a lack of capital that would deter entrepreneurship, because there is tons of capital sitting outside of India which is waiting to be invested in India. So it's really the world's looking to us from a market, both from a market standpoint as well as from an opportunity standpoint. But the problem is in India, where you have to reach a certain point and certain scale in your business, the ability for smaller companies to do that without access to a lot of capital and efficient capital is very difficult. And it's not only that, it's also access to human capital, it's access to logistics, access to infrastructure, the market acceptance of a new product or service. I mean, when you look at the revenue per user, I mean that would be a benchmark. It's still the per capita consumption of goods and services still is the lowest in India. So I keep coming back to Manisha's point. If we create an ecosystem, the government focuses on creating opportunity and across the board for more people to come into the mainstream rather than focusing only on the rural sector or the agricultural sector and keeping people within that sector and not having them have access to education so that they can move on to mainstream industries. I think that's going to be a bigger challenge. I don't think access to capital is a challenge.
Alok and Pearl, I'd like to talk to both of you mainly about the tech space and what's changed there when it comes to the entire entrepreneurial spirit that we are seeing now vis-a-vis what we saw in the initial .com boom followed by the bust years. Alok, what has changed? Are entrepreneurs now realizing that you need a sustainable revenue model before you can go ahead and plan a venture? Do you think there is a greater amount of realism when it comes to the overall e-commerce space and entrepreneurs there?
So what has changed is about 15 years. You know, the first boom was 1999, 2000. We're talking about 2012, 13. And 13 years in a tech business is a lot. It's 130 years. So what happens today is entrepreneurs know everything. They've looked at every company that's gone and come. They've looked at what businesses have failed. They looked at what VCs pay for what, who exits at what stage. And I think most importantly, we've got great talent. I mean, I would say some of the great technology companies that were built out of India have spewed that talent out. Look at the Amazon guys, the Yahoo guys, the eBay guys, all of them now, 40-year-old guys in Hyderabad and Bangalore, fed up of, working in a service job. They have so much knowledge, they could be the next Amazon out of India. So the beauty is, we've got knowledge, we've got capital because, there are enough venture capitalists around, surrounding the right technology guys. And we've got, just the ability to look at an idea and not focus on India. We say, look, this is a global company coming out of India with a global market. And that's the beauty of how entrepreneurs are speaking today. In 99, 2000, everybody said,
my question to you is that why is it that India hasn't been able to produce a huge technology giant like, say, a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter? The world looks to India when we talk about technology expertise, but we are waiting for that one big idea coming from an Indian entrepreneur that clearly shakes up the world in the technology space.
I think that's being too unfair. You just name 3 companies. If I ask you to name the 500 companies in the US that exited at $1 billion, you only know them. And that's not fair. That's like saying every movie has to be a Sholay. There's only one Sholay that was ever made in India. And you can't say Bollywood doesn't work because there's no Sholay. I think there are enough companies in India that have demonstrated nice, big, juicy exits. And at the end of the day, if I'm giving 20, 30x to my VC, that's fine. I mean, which bank gives you 30x return on its money? So I think we should not glorify every moment like the Big Bang Theory, and every time you don't have to have one Big Bang moment to say, either you do this or you're failed. I mean, the US is great examples of good, bad, ugly, everything comes together to make something prosper. So let's be fair to entrepreneurs.
Fair enough, Alok. That's a very valid point. Pearl, do you also share the kind of enthusiasm and optimism that Alok is talking about the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that we are seeing in the country right now? And also your experiences in the technology space and the kind of ideas we are seeing in the overall technology space right now.
So yes, I absolutely share the enthusiasm. I think very clearly, so there's the knowledge banks now available. There are businesses, internet big platform companies which have come into the country over the past decade and shown growth and value back to the society. They are currently making their first steps towards helping and grooming entrepreneurs. There are not all entrepreneurs are only first generation entrepreneurs in the tech space today. There is a ready pool of mentorship available that entrepreneurs can give to now first time entrepreneurs and help them accelerate in whichever formats through their connections and operating experience. Besides that, in terms of the kind of ideas you're saying, well, I'm very gung-ho because when we just launched a month and a half back, less than that slightly, and the kind of businesses we are meeting, it's really heartening. It's not only happening in commerce and media, but product companies, very smart product companies coming out of Bangalore, Pune, Delhi, Bombay. I mean, there are about 6, 7 cities where we're seeing entrepreneurship really start to, in the tech space, really start to come, start showing great signs of promise. Very smart product companies. So to your point, no Facebook from India yet, but I think Indian entrepreneurs, to the point that the previous panelist made, was that Indian entrepreneurs are no longer thinking only India, they're thinking global products. We are able to see the early signs and the ecosystem, and like Rahul said, there is enough capital available. So I'm very gung-ho that over the next 3 to 4 years, this system, there's going to be a huge boom in how entrepreneurs in the tech space are going to take the next step forward.
All right. Now, my question to Mr. Sabharwal really is that are we doing enough in terms of mentorship? Because that's a point that Pearl had raised in the earlier segment. Is there a case for the overall ecosystem to provide that mentorship and guidance to young budding entrepreneurs to really provide that environment? Is there a case for us to actually work on that area? Is that really the missing piece of the puzzle?
I think we're just seeing first-generation entrepreneurs have exits. You know, in mentorship, the messenger is more important than the message. So just like for us, the early role models in the 90s, whoever it was, for our generation was there. I think we still don't have enough mentors out there with the credibility and the sort of, they've seen the movie before, they know how it ends. So I think that's a natural process. It is accelerating. Can it be done? Can it be orchestrated? You know, I'm a little worried about sort of trying to systematize innovation or trying to systematize mentoring. But I think that yes, it is happening much more than it did, and it will accelerate going forward.
Okay, now I would start taking closing comments from all our panelists as to what exactly is needed here on to at least ensure that we create the right ecosystem. There are no major hurdles to the overall entrepreneurship spirit that we are seeing, and whether you really think that it's something that is increasing or do you think it's decreasing as a trend, the fact that more and more people want to set up ventures. Rahul.
Sure. So I guess the message, you know, to the government is first do no harm, right? So,
Okay.
so I guess.
And what could that harm be? For instance,
for
policies
instance,
like you were saying with retrospective effect.
Yeah,
that
policies with retrospective effect, or you know the challenges of, for instance, allowing domestic venture capital funds to access, you know, say Provident Fund, right? In the rest of the world, endowments and pension funds are a big contributor to venture capital. In this part of the world, it's actually not allowed, right?
What about taxing angel investors and venture capitalists?
Right? So
is that a concern area as well?
It is a huge concern area. So, you know, last year there was some questions around whether angel investments would actually be taxed at the hands of the company, right? And so, you know, lots of angel investments got put on hold because there was no clarity on who has to pay that tax. So I think, you know, let's, you know, from a regulatory perspective, I think clarity on these sorts of issues is very important, right? But actually I'm very positive on, you know, the level of energy that we're seeing in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I think it's important that, you know, it gets the attention it deserves from the government, and there is, you know, sort of this both a horizontal view but also a vertical-led view, because we need more focus on manufacturing, we need more focus on healthcare, we need more focus on education. We can't get there just by having a generic policy. So I think it's important to start to think about what are those new sunrise industries and what is the infrastructure required to support those.
And that brings me to the overall issue of social entrepreneurship, yes, which really is emerging as the new buzzword. Explain to our viewers what that's all about, because you mentioned healthcare, education as areas.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think, you know, there have been some commercial success stories already around people who said, look, we're going to drive affordable healthcare. For instance, eye care. There are several companies that are going after driving you know, innovation in eye care surgery, removal of cataract, things like that. That are doing tens of thousands of operations very successfully and very profitably, starting from bottoms up. I think similarly, education is ripe for innovation. It's clear that the government cannot solve the issue of quality education. And in fact, that's one of the key sectors where I think the government should step back and allow private enterprise in, because private enterprise will deliver on that.
And there would be enough capital chasing those ideas.
Absolutely.
The whole idea that just because it has a social objective, it may not make money, it doesn't hold good anymore.
You know, it's as simple as looking at share of wallet, right? If you look at what the Indian family spends on, say, food and travel and education, education and healthcare are two very big buckets, which are still largely controlled by the government.
Right, right. Yes,
my perspective is pretty similar to Rahul's, and we were talking about this offline. I think the government needs to create an opportunity, not only an overall ecosystem through an entrepreneurial council or whatever they might want to call it, because it exists currently in some shape or form in every state. But at the same time, if they focus on core areas like infrastructure, education, power, these are the areas that would enable the upliftment and level the playing field for more people to come into the consuming class. Primary education, in my opinion, is one area that requires a significant amount of investment. And if the government is unwilling to make that investment in primary education, then it's very difficult to invest in the IIMs and the IITs and have a handful of people that come out of these, you know, so-called fantastically well-renowned institutions, but half of them actually leave the country to work for companies that offer them, or countries that offer them, better quality of life and better opportunity. So I think if we create a better, you know, primary education and secondary education system, it's going to take care of a lot of the problems that India currently faces.
Mr. Sabharwal, your closing comment.
Yeah, I think that big government or small government is the wrong question, and no government is the wrong prescription. I mean, Pakistan's Swat Valley has no government, Afghanistan's Waziristan has no government, and that's not exactly hotbeds of entrepreneurship. So I think the question is effective government, and effective government to me, if they're just able to provide the infrastructure, if they fix the labor laws, if we plan our cities better, and just allow entrepreneurs the basic infrastructure on which to build their enterprises. Anyway, there's a Cambrian explosion of entrepreneurship going on. We'll make sure that most of these are not dwarfs, but they'll end up being babies.
Okay. Alok?
I think basically just get your facts right. I think Chidambaram and company need to just sit down with some of the new age entrepreneurs and figure out what really is the problem. If they just tinker around on simple things like how does equity just land up with people, and how can we make it easy to issue simple basic things? How do we make money, as I said, remitting money easy. PayPal, can you imagine you can't use PayPal in India without such a big draconian mess? How do I give money to someone in Siberia who's making a game for me or a service for me if I don't use PayPal? So I think I think they're missing the woods for the trees. They should first climb the trees and then look at the woods. That's what I would tell the government.
Okay, that sounds very simple, but is it really? Dr. Krishna, last comment from you, sir.
Yeah, there is a lot of focus at this panel on the financing aspects of it, but the mentoring, the education, helping students or future entrepreneurs to come up with the right mindset and the right amount of government intervention. By that I mean, if you take IT industry, it has done well, setting up STP policies at that time, access to data networks and so on. That's what really created IT industry in the last 15 years. Without those policy interventions, IT industry wouldn't have been here where it is today. So right amount of government intervention is needed, but the focus on mentoring and access to innovation and the other infrastructure my co-panelists talked about is also critical.
Pearl, last comment from you.
Yep, very positive about what's happening in the country on entrepreneurship. Government can do more, can facilitate more. Government, business and academia, these three forces have to collaborate. I don't think one without the other can be as effective as they can be if they join hands. Would love to see academia do more. Would love to see government make it simpler, faster, better, as well as make it just easier for, if nothing else, funds to be made available to early stage entrepreneurship. That is a clear impact that the government can start making if they become decisive about it. And mentoring from first, second-time entrepreneurs, support from businesses that have established themselves. These are maybe ideal parts of the ecosystem that need to come together. But across the globe where entrepreneurship has really taken off, all these three parts have come together in ways that they could individually collaborate. And that's what will make it really prosper. But with or without government, entrepreneurship in India is going to continue to happen in a very big way over the next 3 to 5 years. It's going to be a big sea change, is the way I see it.
Right, and I can see Alok smiling on that one at least, but we've clearly run out of time on the show. It's been a very interesting discussion, and the consensus really is that yes, you need all stakeholders to do their bit to improve the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Many thanks all of you for joining us and sharing your views here on We Mean Business. With that, it's a wrap here on this show. Remember, you, the viewer, can also send us your feedback and comments on the show. You can write to us at wmb@ndtv.com. You can send us an SMS at WMB space your comment at 56388. You can also write to me on my Twitter handle at ShwetaRK NDTV. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.